Hey, welcome back to the Métropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is part 2 in our deck building 101 guide focusing on System Gateway. And in this video, we're going to be building our first ever runner deck. Now, of course, this is System Gateway. This is the foundational learn to play set that Null Signal Games put out in 2021, and it is absolutely fantastic. When you pick it up, there are 2 pre-constructed decks, the Catalyst versus the Syndicate, and while they're great at teaching you the games, they're not legal constructed decks in largely any other format. So once you've got enough games in with those 2 decks, you're expected to deconstruct them, and then with the 75 cards in System Gateway, start your deck building journey. That's where this video series picks up. And in the first video in the series, we did our first corporation deck in System Gateway. I'd recommend watching that one first if you haven't. It should be linked below because we go over some of the basics of using Netrunner DB, the website we will be using today. Now we will be going over some of that stuff, but I'd recommend watching that first. But in this video, now we have our corp deck. We're going to be building our first ever runner deck. Not only will we be building our deck and explaining our thought process, we're also going to be going over a bunch of best practices and the sort of things that I wish I learned when I was building my first runner decks that will help you not only in your first deck, but probably also your 100th deck. So we have a lot to talk about. Let's dive in. Firstly, though, 2 things off the top, as we always say, if you have any questions at any point in time while watching this video, don't hesitate to ask them in the YouTube comments. I love answering questions. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And secondly, if you appreciate content like this, if you want to take a second just to drop a like on the YouTube video, it really does help the channel. And with that, let's dive in. As we said, we're doing our deck building online, no different than the first time on Netrunner DB. This website's fantastic. You probably already have an account. It's entirely free to make. It's also important to understand what kind of deck are we going to be building. And we're specifically going to be building a runner deck that wants to run a lot. We're going to be running all the time. And I think this is actually a really fun deck to be your first runner deck in System Gateway for 2 reasons. Firstly, running is fun. It's just really good. It's the fun part of Netrunner where you get to go touch cards and see what the corporation's up to. It's just really exciting, and focusing on that is always great. Secondly, I think aggression will overall make you a better Netrunner player. I notice a lot of newer players are a bit hesitant to start running. They generally want to wait till they get their programs down, their icebreakers, and then they want to start running into stuff. And I think overall, you want to break that practice as soon as you can. Turn 1, if the corporation puts an ice on HQ, run it. You want to force them to res their ice. You want to touch their cards, make them spend money, figure out what their stuff is before you worry about your icebreakers. So we're going to have a deck that wants to be running as soon as click 1 on turn 1 and all the time largely. And I think that's going to be fun to teach good fundamentals, and it's just also running is fun. So we're going to build our first deck. We're going to go to the My Decks tab, which will open the page where you have your decks. Hopefully you have your first corporation deck here where you built in the last video. And otherwise, we're going to go to the new runner deck tab at the top. Now, this opens up similarly to when you try and build a corp deck. It opens this page which asks you to choose your identity. On the corp side, we chose our corporation. On the runner side, we get to pick which runner we want to be. And when we played the Catalyst versus the Syndicate, we were the Catalyst, and the Catalyst identity was this card on the table. And this card functionally had no use. It didn't do anything. It was just there so you have an idea, I guess, who you are, but in terms of the rules and the game, it really didn't matter. And now instead we get to make a very important and a very mattering choice. And it's largely 2 choices again when we come to picking our identity. The first choice is what faction runner do we want to be? And there's largely 3 factions in Netrunner. They're anarchs, as we see here. They're largely disruptive. We have criminals that run for self-gain and self-interest. And then we have shapers who run because of self-expression. And it's kind of a fun thing to do. Now, this is really important because whatever faction runner we pick, that's going to be a big limiter on what kind of cards we can put in our deck. If we play a Shaper faction deck, our deck is going to contain a lot of Shaper cards. The Shaper card pool is different than the Criminal card pool and the Anarch card pool, so it's actually a very important decision. On top of that, once we pick our faction, then within the faction, we have to pick which identity, and that comes down to which actual runner do we want to embody. And on this page, there are a lot of choices. In fact, there's way more choices than we have in System Gateway. Specifically, this page here shows us all the runner identities in the standard format. Now, standard is a large format. It's a very popular format. It encompasses the last 7 years of both Fantasy Flight Games and Null Signal Games cards. As of early next year, it will actually only be Null Signal Games cards, which is pretty exciting for the future of Netrunner. But this is the format where like the World Championship takes place in. I play a lot of standard. And unfortunately on this page, it's going to show you a lot of standard identities. There is no way to filter this down to only show you the System Gateway identities. The best we have is if we hit Control F or Command F, we can search System Gateway and we can just jump through the 3 identities. Now there's only 3 options. So largely when we pick our identity, we only have to make one choice, which is what faction, because each faction only has one option. Either we can be the Wilder Lu, we can be the Criminal Smuggler Zahya Sadeghi, or we can be the Shaper Thao Salonga. Now, for our first deck, we want to build something that's running all the time, and that is largely what criminals do. So our choice here is going to be Zahya Sadeghi, the Versatile Smuggler. We're going to click on Zahya and get out of this identity page. Now this takes us to the deck builder page and a quick review. Again, we go into this in more depth in the first video. The left side of the page shows us our deck that we're building. Currently, we have a tabula rasa, so any cards that we add here will kind of fill in this blank spot. Currently, our deck has no cards. The right side of the page is the card browser that allows us to sort through different factions and different card types. Now, you might not have to do this because it should remember the last time you did a deck build on the corporation side, but we want to make it so that we only look at system gateway cards. Currently, it's also showing me all cards from the standard format, which includes system gateway, but it also includes hundreds and hundreds of other cards. So to do that, we go to the collection tab really quickly, we hit the none button, and we just highlight system gateway. So now when we go back, the browser will exclusively show us the 75 cards from system gateway, technically the 31 runner cards. The last thing we want to do is we want to pop down to the bottom here, and next to the ban list, it says standard ban list 2409, which is the active ban list at the time of recording, November 2024. We just want to hit the casual button really quickly. And all we're saying is that we don't care about the current ban list. The standard ban list, as you might guess, is a list of cards that are banned in the standard format. Again, the standard format does include system gateway, but for this thing that we're building right now that is just system gateway versus system gateway, we do not care about what's going on in standard organized play. Notably, at the point of recording, none of the cards in System Gateway are currently on a ban list. If they were on a ban list, say for instance Tread Lightly was banned, we just would not find it in the card browser. So if you're trying to replicate this deck list in the near future and you can't find a certain card, there's a big chance that it's on the ban list, and any card on the ban list will just not show up in the card browser unless you hit the casual button. Netrunner DB is fantastic. It kind of holds your hands through most part of the deck building, and it just will not allow you to put an illegal card into your deck. That being said, to future-proof the video, we're going to hit the casual button to make sure we're going to see all the system gateway cards, no matter what standard looks like in years from now. Awesome. And with that, we can talk about some basic ideas when it comes to cards, and none of this is going to be a surprise if you've already watched the corp side of the video. But to go over some basics, we need to understand how factions work, because for the first time, maybe in System Gateway, we're doing factional deck building. And so understanding that cards come from certain factions is really important. Tread Lightly here is a criminal card. You can tell it's criminal because it has the criminal logo in the bottom right corner here, the sort of skull. That logo also appears in the watermark behind the card text, and if you can see color, the card is quite blue. That's important to understand that this is a criminal card, and you'll see cards across all different factions. So for instance, a Shaper card follows that same sort of pattern, except it's green and it has the Shaper logo in different places. Now notably, just like on the corporation side, there are also truly neutral runner cards. So this is Sure Gamble, which is a neutral runner card, and you can tell because there's no logos, the background is white, and it's clean. This card belongs to no faction, which means it belongs to all factions. So all the cards in System Gateway are either Anarch, Criminal, Shaper cards, or they're neutral cards. And why that's important is we chose Zahya Sadeghi, our versatile smuggler, and Zahya is a criminal identity. You can tell for the same reasons. There's the criminal logo in the top right corner and in the watermark, and of course this card is quite blue, if you can see color. Now, why that's important is because whatever faction your identity comes from will restrict the cards you can put in your deck. Inherently, our criminal identity is allowed to play every single criminal and every single neutral card. So we can play Tread Lightly, we can play Sure Gamble, but we're not going to be able to play all of the Shaper and all of the Anarch cards. This is really important because when you sit down across from an Anarch identity, an Anarch runner, you'll have an idea their deck is mostly Anarch cards, and Anarch cards often do something different than criminal cards do. So you have an idea of what the matchup looks like. So understanding we are playing Zahya, so most of our deck will be both criminal and neutral cards. Now also, in a much more exciting way than the Catalyst, our identity has identity text, which means we generally have an active or some sort of passive ability that starts in play and will remain in play, will matter on most turns of a game. So Zahya's text box reads, whenever a run on HQ or R&D ends, you may choose to gain a credit for each time you accessed a card during that run. You can use this ability once per turn. So in short, if we run R&D and we see a card, after the run has ended, we can choose to gain 1 credit because we saw 1 card. Say instead we run HQ and we see 3 cards, as long as we've only done this ability once per turn, on that run, we could gain 3 credits. Importantly, it's not first time per turn, it's once per turn. So if you run R&D for 1 card, then HQ for 3 cards, keep that ability for the HQ run because you'll get more money. And this is hopefully very obviously a really big part in our strategy. We want to have a deck that runs all the time. And Zahya's ability is fantastic because she really encourages you to run and go touch the corporation's cards. As soon as turn 1, if our corporation doesn't ice R&D or doesn't ice HQ, we're often running R&D and running our HQ. Because not only do we get to see one of their cards, maybe steal an agenda, but we're going to get a credit. So it's better than clicking for credit, And so much of what our deck is going to do is incentivize us to run because all of our runs are going to be profitable and push us forward. I really like Zahya for a learn to play identity for your first runner deck because it gives you a very clear idea on every turn. Largely, you want to fire her ability on every turn. We should be running run R&D, run HQ. It's going to pay off really quite well. Now that ability, again, is online for the whole game. You just have to remember it's there. You will forget every once in a while. Try and make sure you remember that text. But also there's a whole bunch of different numbers across the identity, kind of similarly to how a corporation deck works. And we just need to understand these numbers because they dictate a bit about deck building. Now, identically to how this works in a corporation, in the bottom right corner of the card, this 15 in this sort of black shape, this is our influence limit. This is a currency that we can spend during deck building to bring in cards from the other factions. So again, our criminal identity can play all the criminal and neutral cards, but we can spend influence to start playing some of those anarch and some of those shaper cards. So for instance, this is Creative Commission, and as we said, it's a shaper card. And you'll notice every single card on the runner side largely has this like 5-dot picto bar graph. And for each dot that's highlighted, that indicates how much influence this will cost you if you want to bring this card into your deck from a different faction. So for criminal, we can't inherently play shaper cards. So for each copy of Creative Commission we want to put into our criminal deck, we have to pay 2 of our 15 influence. So a single copy is 2 influence. If we want to play a full playset, that will be 6 influence. We can also play 2 copies. It's worth noting I did not say this explicitly in the last video on the corp side, but the most you can play of a single card is 3 copies. Also a really fun thing here, I'm going to add 3 copies of Creative Commission to the deck. You can always click these numbers at the top of Netrunner DB to add those many copies to your deck. I just hit the number on my keyboard. That also works. So notably, Creative Commission is 2 influence. We played 3 copies and we now have spent 6 influence. Netrunner DB will remind us here at the top 6 influence spent of our max 15, 9 left. And it'll also give you these 6 green dots to remind you very clearly that we've spent influence on Creative Commission. That's how influence works. It's identical to on the corp side. So inherently for Zahya, if we want to play anarch and we want to play shaper cards, we're going to have to spend influence to bring those in from out of faction. Now, of course, you're not required to spend all of your influence. You have 15, you can spend 0 or spend 15. And I highly recommend in all decks you build, try and spend all 15. Every faction has their own strengths. For instance, the Anarch card pool has a whole set of very interesting and some particularly aggressive viruses. Now, if we want to put those viruses into our criminal deck, we have to spend influence, and that is another way we can add an additional strength to our deck. That's a really nice way of using influence. If your faction is not good at a certain thing or they don't have access to a certain thing, bring that thing into your faction. Secondly, influence is just really fun to use. It gives you a lot of creative expression with deck building. You can build themes, you can build certain interactions, again, your opponent might not expect, but it's often when you do your deck building and you share your deck to your friends, your metamates, whoever it may be, showing off how you creatively spent your influence is almost always a highlight. So influence is very good for making your deck more robust, but also just kind of fun to use. So while you don't have to spend all 15, in most decks you'll see posted on Netrunner DB, just about everyone uses all 15 because it's just kind of a treat. Now, very importantly, how much influence you spent during deck building is private information. You do not have to reveal that to your opponent. They'll try and see how much influence you've spent throughout the game by seeing the cards hit the table. But you have 15 to spend, you're going to try and spend all 15. Secondly, in the bottom left corner, identically to the corp side, this 40 in the sort of gray shape, that is our minimum deck size. That means we have to play at least 40 cards. Now, Zahya, the identity card, does not count towards that deck size, so we need 40 cards and Zahya. This is a minimum. We have no maximum. In theory, you can build a 90 card Zahya deck. I don't think there's actually that many cards you can legally do that in System Gateway, but there is no maximum. It's only a minimum. When it comes to corporation deck building, there were some additional rules where your deck size dictates how many agenda points you have to have in your deck. And as the deck size goes up, the agenda points come up and there's a ratio you have to remember. On the runner side, there's nothing like that. It's super easy. All you have to do is just play 40 cards. And again, don't spend more than 15 influence. As long as you do that, you should have a legal deck. It's much easier, I think, to build a legal runner deck. At least 40 cards and 15 or less influence. We're going to try and spend 15. Now on the runner side, uniquely, there's 2 numbers in the top left corner. Corporations don't have these numbers. Just to go over them really quickly, this 4 in the sort of like chip symbol, that is just reminder text to say that we have 4 starting MU. This shouldn't be surprising if you've played, again, the Catalyst versus the Syndicate, but certain programs take up certain amounts of MU. Normally 1, sometimes 2. So if we install Carmen, it takes up 1 of our memory units, our MU. This is just reminder text. Every identity in System Gateway and most every identity in the game starts with 4 base MU. This is just reminder. You might notice on old Fantasy Flight Games identities, this text didn't exist. This number isn't shown there. It was just given in the rulebook that 4 is the base. So if you see FFG, 4 is not written, but they have 4 starting MU. Now the next number in the top left corner, this is a weirder one. This 0 seems like it's a pretty prominent number. It's pretty big. And next to it, you see the 2 like rectangles, the 2 squares overlapping. This is called your base link. Now there's a short story into a long story of what this is. The short story is this is useless. It doesn't matter. You don't have to worry about it. Link is not anything that comes up in System Gateway. We're not going to be interacting with any cards that care about the number. You can forget about it. The longer answer is that link is attached to this mechanic called tracing that goes back all the way to 1996 CCG Netrunner and FFG Netrunner. And it is basically a money war in which the corporation wants to spend more money than the runner so they can pin down the runner. And then generally something bad happens to the runner. This was a mechanic that was supported across the entirety of the Fantasy Flight Games card pool, and having a higher number here, a higher base link, means your character was harder to trace. Important to know that in the standard card pool, there are still some trace cards, and also No Signal Games has printed a couple trace cards in the past. They haven't printed any trace cards in the last 3 years, though, and they've been pretty clear. Former designers have said that they don't think tracing is that interesting, and it looks at this point like it's a bit of a deprecated mechanic. That being said, in System Gateway, there is no trace, there's no link. If you play in a bigger card pool, you'll run into trace and link 1 in every maybe 20 games. It's not particularly common. If you want to know how it works, you can search trace Netrunner and look a bit deeper into the rules. We're not going to talk about it too much, but it's worth noting it does not matter. Maybe in the future, No Signal Games will find out a different way to use base link values, but you're just going to see zeros on all the runners and you can ignore them. It takes up a lot of the card. Very strange. But that's it. That's our entirety of our identity. We're Zahya, we're a criminal identity, which means we can play all the criminal and all the neutral cards. We have this really good text box that encourages us every turn to run central servers, run R&D and HQ specifically to get paid. We can have 15 influence to spend on the Anarch and the Shaper cards. We have to play at least 40 cards. We're going to aim for that 40 card. I didn't mention it, but the smaller your deck is, the more consistent it is. That's no different than when we talked about corp deck building. So we are going to play 40 cards to make the most consistent deck possible. We have 4 MU, and Link is a thing nobody cares about. Cool. And with that, we can start doing some deck building. Let's just clean this up really quickly. Oh, I should say 2 things here too. Firstly, I mentioned this on the corp side, that our identity choice we made on the first page when we started, you can change that. You're actually not married to that decision. So if we want to change our identity to either a different criminal identity, which there are none in System Gateway, but if we want to suddenly become an Anarch identity, we can change that midway through deck building. So the decision we make on page 1, unfortunately, doesn't exactly matter, but it's nice that it's there because it's a starting point. Secondly, you'll notice here, so this on the right, these are the different types of cards that we can filter through. So hardware, events, programs, resources, and identities. On the left, these show the factions. So we have Anarch, Criminal, Shaper, and this Helix N, that's for neutral cards. Now you might be wondering, what are these symbols? There's Atom, there's Apex, and then there's Sunny LeBeau. These are mini factions that existed back in Fantasy Flight Games times that were small factions that had only about a dozen or so cards in their card pool. They were really cool. They were pretty beloved, but they're not in System Gateway, obviously. So these buttons are going to have no impact on our deck filtering at all. If you're wondering what they are, they're kind of a bit of an artifact of older times. There's technically still some Sunny and mini faction cards in the standard card pool, but they're old. Cool. So before we start actually adding cards into our deck, I think we're going to just sit back and do some really high level understanding and dissect a runner deck. Because I think you can take every single runner deck from System Gateway, your first ever deck, to more advanced decks in a bigger card pool. And every runner deck largely can be broken down to 5 categories of 5 things that every deck needs to do. We did this when we built our corporation deck, as we were very clear. We need ice, we need agendas, we need defensive upgrades. And how we built the deck is we just basically went from one camp to the second camp, just filled the cards in, and we're largely going to be able to do the same thing. But I think overall, understanding that every single runner deck needs to do these 5 things, whenever you build any other deck, just go through these sections and fill these out. And this should put you close to building a pretty functional deck relatively quickly. So our first camp of things that our deck needs to do is we need to deal with ice. Obviously, corporations are going to be playing some amount of ice, and that ice is going to hit the table, and some of that ice will end the run, and some of that other ice will just do kind of nasty stuff to us. Now, if we want to touch enough of those corporations' cards, we need ways to deal with that ice. And largely, that's going to mean in System Gateway, we need to play Icebreakers. That should be no surprise, but we're going to put some cards in our deck that break ice. And we're going to have to be able to break all the 3 different types of ice we expect. barriers that largely end the run, code gates that sometimes end the run, and sentries that rarely end the run but often do bad things to us and or our property. So we need to make sure our deck has ways to deal with ice. Again, not a surprise, and also when you get to a bigger card pool, this is not necessarily always icebreakers. In a bigger card pool, there's other ways to circumvent and bypass ice, so you can get a bit more creative, but it's going to be pretty straightforward, at least in System Gateway. Now, compartment 2 of every runner deck, this might not be particularly sexy, but it is incredibly important, and that is economy. Every deck just needs ways to generate credits. You need credits, and that's because, well, inherently we talked about using icebreakers. Icebreakers cost money to install, let alone to break subroutines, but you're going to need money to do all the sort of things you want to do. So we need to make sure we put enough economy cards in our deck, and economy card is largely any card that can give us credits faster than the basic action of clicking for credit. Now, the basic action card in Netrunner is really important. You have to remember it's there. You can always click for a credit. You can always click for a card draw. And generally, the more you play constructed decks and bigger formats, you're going to find that you rely on that basic action to click for a credit and click for a card less and less often. In System Gateway, you're going to be clicking for credits somewhat. You're going to be drawing cards with the basic action a fair bit, so don't discount them. They're very powerful actions. But the idea is that if we can put in a card in our deck that clicks for 4 credits, that saves us a lot of time. It's easy to forget this, but any given game of Netrunner is only so many clicks long. Well, imagine our System Gateway game is only 12 turns. That means we might just have 48 clicks. Now, the idea is if we play Sure Gamble, that's a click for 4 credits. And that means we can spend less of our other 47 clicks clicking for credits. So as much as possible, you want cards that accelerate you to get money because the baseline is just 1 click for 1 credit. Not awful, but as much as possible, we want to put cards in our deck to avoid that. This also allows you to look at different cards and try and calculate what is their credit per click is a thing that comes up a lot. And the more you play the game, the more you realize how fast games are or how slow games are, the more you value certain card engines and certain economy engines. Now, 12 turns or 48 clicks might actually be a bit fast for System Gateway. It's not the fastest format. The power level is a bit lower because there's a smaller card pool, but just keep that in mind. As you go to a different format, a bigger card pool, that number usually goes down. You usually have fewer turns to figure out how the game works. Now, similarly to the econ package that every deck needs, you also want to consider a card draw package. And this is the exact same issue we run into with credits, is most card games are about taking the cards in your deck, putting them into your hand, and then getting them onto the table. And again, if we only have 48 clicks in a game, potentially, we're going to have to spend a bunch of those getting cards into our hand. So if we can play a card that draws 4 cards for a click, 3 cards for a click, that's much better than the basic action of drawing cards. So I do think every deck should have some amount of cards that allow them to draw more cards faster than the basic action. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time with the basic action. As a bit of a spoiler, card draw is pretty few and far between in System Gateway. You're actually going to be spending a fair bit of time using that basic action to draw cards. There's just not a lot of card draw in System Gateway. So as a rule, if we can spend more of our time clicking to draw and less of our time to clicking for credit, so maybe we play a couple more econ cards to offset the fact that we don't have a lot of card draw cards, that usually works out well in System Gateway. But they're both very important tasks. More decks will have more econ than card draw on average, but they're both quite important. As a rule, and I think we can nail this in System Gateway, I think just about half our deck should and can be economy cards. So we'll do this check once we finish our deck building. It's not something we'll keep in mind really when we're putting the cards together, but once we finish this deck, I'll try and remember to go through and see. We want about 1 in every 2 cards in our deck, maybe somewhere between 1 and 2 and 1 in every 3 cards in our deck to be a card that gives us credits at a rate better than the click for credit button. For card draw, unfortunately for System Gateway, we'll just take whatever we can get, which is not a lot. Now, the fourth category for what every deck needs is you need a win condition. You need some way to close the game out. Specifically, when it comes to System Gateway, and even in some bigger formats, we're going to be looking at something called multi-access. Multi-access is the term for a card that makes your run see more cards. Now, there's a rule that's been floating around in Netrunner for a really long time. I know I learned this rule, or specifically this number, when I was learning the game, again, nearly a decade ago now. And that number is 17. It's a strange number, but that is the number of, on average, how many different cards a runner needs to access from central servers to have at least a 50% chance of stealing 7 agenda points. Now, this comes down to a hyper-geometric equation. There is some naivety and some assumptions about how this model works, but it's a pretty good number to keep in mind. That on average, if you're going to just be running R&D and seeing the top card turn after turn after turn, which is not the best game plan, you're going to have to see about 17 cards to have a 50% chance of winning that game. That's a really big number. When we talked about that 12-turn game, again, those 48 clicks we have as a runner, if we have to spend 17 of those clicks running R&D just to have at least a 50% chance, that's a lot of clicks and potentially also a lot of money that we have to spend breaking the ice that is on R&D. And this is one of the really big values of cards like Docklands Pass or any multi-axis cards, because they multiply the value of your run. The idea is now we can see 2 cards, potentially 3 or 4 cards with a single run on a central server, and that saves us clicks, that saves us credits. There are some other ways that multi-axis is even more powerful than that numerically, and we'll talk about that once we add multi-axis cards to our deck. But ensuring that your deck has some way to see more than just a single card whenever you're running is very important. And it's something I've seen a lot of newer deck builders forget to put into their deck, and then they're struggling because they have to work so much harder and spread their economy out so much thinner because they just need to run more. Notably too, we're playing Zahya, and Zahya just gets paid if she can see more cards. So we're heavily incentivized to play just about as much multi-axis as we can, because anytime we run HQ and see 2 cards, that's also 2 credits, and that's just a great amount of money. So again, 4th spot, we definitely need a multi-axis. We need to see more cards faster because we need to get to that 17 number, and that's a lot of clicks. So we want to try and do that quicker, more efficiently. Now, finally, the last category of cards in every runner deck. This one is a bit hard to explain because it is pretty widely encompassing most other stuff that doesn't exist in the first 4 categories. These are your tricks. These are cards that you put into your deck that are not necessarily multi-axis or economy, but do something surprising, aggressive. They put pressure on your opponents in ways that they might not either expect or might have to spend a lot of time and effort playing around. One example potentially is Tread Lightly. This is a criminal card you can play in System Gateway that makes a run and forces the corporation to spend more money. Sometimes this destabilizes them in a way where they have to now overextend to protect their agenda, or now they can't protect their agenda. These sort of cards are actually incredibly valuable, and they come in many different shapes and sizes. They're not only run events that make the corporation spend more money, but there's always some amount of this in just about every deck you can see that forces the corporation to interact with you on a slightly different axis than they might expect. It's very important and should not be undersold. You're going to want to put a couple cards like this in your deck because not only do they do some cool stuff, they're also pretty fun. And that is the 5 sets of cards that come together to build a runner deck. Firstly, you need to have your ways to deal with ice. That will largely be Icebreakers. You need to have economy, about half the deck usually. Card draw, we're going to have as much as we can. We're going to have multi-axis. Zahya loves multi-axis. We want to get 17 as soon as we can. And then finally, we're going to have some amount of cards that are nice tricks that put pressure and challenge the corporation on kind of avenues they might not expect to be challenged on. And with that, we can start building our runner deck. Now, understanding those 5 sort of compartments that every runner deck has, we're just going to follow that and end up doing deck building by just saying, okay, let's add all our Icebreakers. Okay, we have enough Icebreakers. Let's add all our multi-axis. Once we've done that, we'll add all our card draw. And if we just kind of follow that script, we end up building a pretty high functioning runner deck in System Gateway. Very importantly, System Gateway only has 31 cards. There's actually not that many choices. A lot of situations we end up playing the obvious option. It's just up to us to figure out what that obvious option is. So I think deck building on the runner side specifically is even easier than on the corporation side. And we'll walk through all of that, of course, right now. So let's start by putting together our breaker suite. Let's do box 1, which is we need some way to deal with ice. And as we saw when we built our corporation deck, we're going to have to be breaking all 3 kinds of ice. Our corporation decks we're playing against, we're expecting them to play some amount of barriers, some amount of code gates, and some amount of sentries, which means on our side of the table, we need to play some amount of fractors, some amount of decoders, and some amount of killers. So we just need to decide which ones we play and how many. So if we go to the program tab and we open up every single faction in System Gateway, we can now do some sorting to look at all the options. And we're going to do this the same way we did on the corporation side, which is we're going to look at all the barrier breaker options, decide, then we'll look at the code gate options, and so on and so forth. Now, I mentioned this, and this is a very powerful tool when we did our corp deck building, is that whatever subsection we're already filtering here in the card browser, we can do an additional filter using the operands and operators that Netrunner DB supports. If you want to find out more information, there's a lot of information. You can go to the syntax and open this in another tab. But the only thing that we've talked about so far, and it's, I think the most important thing to remember, is we can always filter by subtype by just typing the letter S. S for subtype. So if we want to look at all the fractors, which is a subtype of Icebreaker, which is a subtype of program, fractors break barriers, let's just look at the barrier breakers. And we do S:fractor. And this will just show us the fractors. And it turns out in System Gateway, there's only 2 options. We basically need to decide which option do we want to play. Now, one of them is a criminal breaker. It's pretty cheap. The other one was an anarch breaker. We have to spend a bit of influence on it, but they're interesting. Now, to decide which of these is worth playing, we have to have an understanding of what ice we're expecting to break. If we've already done our corporation deck building, this shouldn't be a surprise, but we're going to do this the same way we did on the corporation side. Understanding if Cleaver is going to be on average better than Marjana, we have to look at some numbers. Now, what makes a better icebreaker? Icebreakers are largely valued on whichever is the cheaper thing overall. Marjana comes down for no credits. Cleaver comes down for 3 credits. That's already a consideration. One of them is going to be cheaper to get down on the table and start running as soon as possible. But once you've got over that 3 credit cost for the Cleaver, the next question is, on average, how many barriers do we break cheaper with the Cleaver than we do with the Marjana? That is what we have to understand. Obviously, the upfront savings are one thing, but if a Marjana is just so much more expensive over the longer game than Cleaver, maybe we should spend influence on Cleaver. It's actually really important for us to understand what is going to be the cheaper breaker overall through a game where we run a lot, because we want to run a lot. If Marjana costs us 3 credits to run HQ every turn, but Cleaver costs us 1 credit, that is a much better breaker for a deck that wants to be running every single turn, because we'll be saving 2 credits every single turn. So it's actually very important for this specific deck that wants to be running all the time that we find out what are the cheaper breakers in most situations. We're going to do that by looking at all the ice we expect to see in System Gateway, which sounds maybe a bit overwhelming, but we're going to keep it as simple as possible. What we're going to do is, in a new tab, we're going to open up the Sets tab. And this on Netrunner DB lets you look through the card browser. We can see all the sort of different sets. This page is organized in release order, so the Liberation Cycle is the most modern set, and we want to open up System Gateway, so we'll just give that a click. Now, this is all the System Gateway cards, but we don't want to look at all the System Gateway cards. We want to look at specifically all the barriers, and we know how to do that. We just go to the search bar here and append across. This is the search term to find System Gateway. If we search the subtype S:barrier, that will find all the ice that are barriers. Before I do that really quickly, I'm just going to go to the View as Checklist dropdown and change that to View as Image. You don't see that. It doesn't record on OBS for some reason. But now if we hit search, it will show us images of all the barriers in System Gateway. And as you notice, there's not that many options. So just looking at these at a really high level, we want to see some trends to have an understanding what's going to be a better breaker through the game. Are we going to be more excited to have some influence spent on Cleaver or in faction the Marjana? So we look at Palisade here on the right. This is the neutral ice, which means you're going to see it in every faction because every faction can play it. It is a 2 strength barrier with a 1 end the run subroutine, but when it's on a remote server, it's a 4 strength barrier. So that means commonly we're going to have to either break a 2 or a 4 strength barrier. That's fine. Here in the middle, we have Ping. It's a 1 strength barrier with a single end the run subroutine. It gives you a tag when it's rezzed. That won't matter which icebreaker we're using, but this thing is a really cheap thing. 1 strength, 1 credit to break it. Usually that's what we're looking at. Now, Brawn and Pharaohs are the big barriers. And I think barriers are actually really quite good in System Gateway because you'll realize Brawn is huge. It has 6 strength and it has 3 subroutines. Now the runner can click through those subroutines even without an icebreaker because that's how biroids work. But that is a big amount of subroutines and a big amount of strength. Similarly, Pharaohs is 5 strength with 3 subroutines. That's very quite similar. But heaven forbid the corporation triple advances the Pharaohs, it suddenly becomes a 10 strength ice. So what it looks like the trend is here is that we have Ping, which is the cheapest ice. Palisade is somewhere in the middle, 2 or 4 strength. And then there's stuff that's like 6 strength or plus. So there's some really big stuff and some minor cheap stuff. Now that's all we need to know. So looking back at our options, we want to kind of consider which one of these we think is going to be better in most games. Now Marjana comes in for free. That's nice. But again, we're going to be running a lot. So we care more about the running cost than it is the install cost. And it comes in at 1 strength. That's not great. I boost 1 for 1 strength, which means that we do obviously break the Ping without boosting. That's nice. But anything that's high strength, and there's, 4 strength, 5 strength, 6 strength, 10 strength ice, we're going to be spending a lot. Now we break 1 subroutine for 2 credits. That's also very expensive. However, it only costs 1 credit to break a subroutine as long as we made a successful run already this turn. Now that's not bad. Breaking 1 for 1 subroutine is kind of what you would expect. This being 2 for 1 subroutine is not good, but if we make a successful run, we can at least make it okay. It's worth noting we want to be making successful runs, but if we have to make our first successful run through a barrier, Marjana is going to kind of be quite expensive. And that's what you'll notice. Marjana is pretty expensive. If we have to break a 6 strength ice, we have to pay 5 credits just to get up the strength, and then we have to pay more for subroutines. So something like a Brawn can cost somewhere between 8 to 11 credits if you haven't made a successful run once per turn. That's very expensive. Marjana is very good at breaking the ping on 1 strength, maybe for 1 credit, hopefully for not 2 credits. But anything that's bigger is going to be really annoying for the Marjana. So it doesn't seem fantastic. Now we have to hope that Cleaver is better. And Cleaver is a fair bit better, but not perfect. Now Cleaver comes in at 3 strength, which seems a fair bit better than Marjana. And for what that's worth, at least at 3 strength, we don't have to boost if we hit a Palisade on a central server, which technically you have to boost into with the Marjana. That would be 2 strength. However, the majority of barriers that we're going to get taxed out by are actually higher than 3 strength. The 4 strength Palisades, the 6 strength Brawn, the 5 or 10 strength Pharaohs. And if we need to boost high strength on Cleaver, it's really quite expensive. Cleaver has to pay 2 credits just to get up 1 strength, and that adds up really quickly. If we want to get up to Bronze strength, we pay 6 credits. That's a lot of money. Now, that being said, we do break 1 credit for 2 barrier subroutines. Half of the barriers in System Gateway have more than 1 subroutine, so you do save at least a credit on half the ice just breaking subroutines. But overall, getting to high strength is going to be expensive. I think we spend 8 credits to fully break a Brawn, so it is just going to be expensive no matter which way you cut it. Pun intended. Now, what you might notice if you look at all the break maths for only the 4 different options we have in System Gateway is that on every single barrier in System Gateway, Cleaver breaks for the same cost, if not cheaper than Marjana. There's just no case where Marjana is the cheaper breaker. No way you slice it. I think actually that's not true. There is one case, which is a 10 strength Pharaohs. I think you break it for like 16 credits with Cleaver. And if you're lucky, 12 credits with the Marjana. Now, you don't want to pay 12 credits to break a single piece of ice. Sometimes you'll have to, but that is not the case where I make decisions on what I put into my deck. Ideally, we'll have a different way to deal with the 10 strength Pharaohs that doesn't require 12 credits. It looks like Cleaver is just going to be the cheaper breaker on more board states more consistently to run. And we need to be running as much as possible because that is our deck idea, because we need to be making credits, making cheap runs. And so we really value having the more efficient, the cheaper Fractor over a long enough period of time. And for that reason, we are going to spend influence and pay a bit more upfront to get Cleaver to be our Fractor as opposed to the Marjana. There's going to be some other ways we're going to make the Cleaver even better. That's going to make it look even stronger than Marjana, but we'll get to that in a bit once we add a couple more cards to our deck. But we can make Cleaver even stronger. Now that we're happy with the Fractor that we've chosen, the next question is how many copies of this Fractor do we put in our deck? Understanding the second copy is not particularly valuable. We don't really need to install both of these. They also cost influence. Do we save influence and play 1 copy? Do we play a full playset or somewhere in the middle? Now, understanding how many copies of an Icebreaker you should put into any given deck is actually a very complicated question in some ways. It depends on your faction, it depends on your opponent, and it depends on your comfortability, how much experience you have with the game. So just to give you an understanding of how this works, different factions have different abilities to grab cards with consistency. We're playing Criminal, and Criminal is actually one of the factions that's the best at finding their Icebreakers when and if they need them. This is a mutual favor. It's a card we will play because it is in System Gateway, but it's a card that just lets you search your deck for an Icebreaker, which means we could technically play fewer Icebreakers and more mutual favors and hopefully find the cards we need when we need them. It's a very powerful effect. And what you'll see in a bigger card pool, like the standard card pool, a lot of Criminal decks are only running 1 of each Icebreaker, having some amount of mutual favors to find their Icebreakers, but additionally, they're bolstered by extra cards that are in the Criminal card pool that don't exist in System Gateway that allow them to do things like bypass ice or play AI Icebreakers that can break all types of ice. So they have fallback plans if they can't find or don't find their Fractor, but some games you want your Fractor, so they have the ability to search for their Fractor. So depending on your faction, Criminal is actually a really strong faction at only playing 1 copy of your Icebreaker, at least in a bigger card pool. In System Gateway, we need our Fractor because it's the only way we're going to be able to break barriers. Secondly, it comes down to your opponent. There are certain archetypes that you will find out when you're playing System Gateway in which your opponent's game plan might include trashing your programs. Retribution is the big tag punishment card in System Gateway and allows your opponent to send the baseball bat into the cleaver. And if you run 1 cleaver and you lose that 1 cleaver to a baseball bat, you're going to have a problem breaking barriers. Now, for that reason, I would recommend in System Gateway where Retribution is kind of common that you want to play a second copy of your cleaver. Just because if 1 gets trashed, you'll have the second one on backup. For that reason, don't discard the second copy. Keep it in hand as much as possible if you can, because on a rainy day, you might need it when the first one is lost. Now, finally, it also comes down with your confidence. This is something that I also recommend with a bigger card pool. If you want to jump into the standard card pool, I would often say that you should play 2 of each breaker. And it's only once you get a bit better at risk management and you get a bit better at putting on pressure to your opponent without actually producing your icebreakers. Those are skills you will develop in time. And the more you have those skills, the less likely you are to need a backup breaker or just getting a breaker early. And the bigger criminal card pool, you can do a lot of damage without installing any icebreakers by just being aggressive. Actually, even in System Gateway, that's our plan for this deck. We want to run before we produce our icebreakers. But overall, the more confident you are with the risks you take and how aggressive you can be, the less likely you are to need a backup breaker. That being said, this is our first deck list. We're playing Criminal and Retribution exists in System Gateway. For all those reasons, for every single breaker we're going to put in our deck, we're going to put in 2 copies. But for a bigger card pool, it's a much more nuanced conversation depending on your faction, your opponent, and your confidence with the game. For now, we'll spend 4 influence, our first card in our deck, 2 copies of Cleaver. Now, all we're going to do is we're going to repeat this process for the other kinds of ice. It should be relatively quick. So the next type of icebreakers we want to look at are decoders. Decoders break code gates, and there are 2 decoders in System Gateway. As you might notice here, none of these decoders are criminal. And that is something that's intentionally done, that every faction, if you want to play all 3 types of normal, regular icebreakers, you have to spend influence. Just this forces you to interact with influence, which is a great system. So now we have to spend influence on Buzzsaw or spend influence on Unity. Let's go look at the code gates. So the code gates are, as you might have heard, when it comes to System Gateway, my least favorite part is System Gateway. In a bigger card pool, they're pretty cool, but in System Gateway, not my favorite part. So looking at the options, the neutral option, white space, that will show up everywhere. It's a very cheap code gate. It's 0 strength, so nobody's going to sweat that. And it has 2 subroutines. The first is a pretty bad face check. Losing 3 credits in the early game kind of does stink. But once you get your icebreaker down, you technically only have to break the first subroutine. So most people are going to break this for 1 credit, because if you have enough money, second subroutine doesn't matter. Now on the left, we have Diviner. It's a Jinteki code gate. It costs 2 credits, which is pretty cheap. It comes in at 3 strength, what's in the middle, and has 1 subroutine that does a net damage and sometimes ends the run. So we just have to keep in mind 3 strength code gate. How much is that going to cost to break? Now on the NBN side, we have Funhouse as our decoder. It's 5 cost, it's 4 strength. So the highest strength we have in all of System Gateway. It gives the runner a tag if they want to go through this, which is pretty annoying. It has a single subroutine that says give the runner a tag unless they pay 4 credits. Now this means that we'll probably pick whatever the right choice is for our board state. But if it ever costs us more than 4 credits to break a Funhouse, or even if it costs us 4 credits to break a Funhouse, we just don't have to install our icebreaker, right? We can already break it for 4 credits. So there's a ceiling on Funhouse, so we just have to keep that in mind. But otherwise, low strength code gate, 3 strength code gate, annoying Funhouse. And our options are not particularly interesting. We have Unity, which is the Shaper Icebreaker, and you'll see this trend across the Shaper Icebreakers in System Gateway. They scale with more icebreakers that you install. So it comes in at 1 strength, and it boosts 1 for 1 strength, but in fact, it boosts 1 for every icebreaker you have strength. Which means if we get all 3 icebreakers down, which is what we're hoping to do at some point in time in the game if we need to, if we haven't won by then, we get up to 4 strength for a single credit. That's good. In the early game, we might have to pay a bit extra to get to the Diviner, but in the late game, we're sailing through everything. We can get to 4 strength. We also break 1 for 1 subroutine. That's fine. It's 3 credits. It's 2 influence. Not too bad. Remember, we have Buzzsaw, and Buzzsaw is basically like a cleaver that breaks code gates. It comes in already at 3 strength, which means it's already dealing with every single code gate besides Funhouse. That's kind of quite nice. It's a bit more expensive. It's less influence though, and it breaks 1 for 2 subroutines. That kind of only matters on the white space sometimes, but that's fine. But it is 3 credits for a single strength. So this puts us at that sort of ceiling that if we need to break a Funhouse, it's 4 credits. So we technically don't need the Buzzsaw. But outside of Funhouse, we break every single code gate in System Gateway for $1. That's why I don't think this is an interesting choice, right? Like, unless you don't want to spend influence and you're playing Shaper, I just think you play 2 Buzzsaw because it breaks every single code gate for the same, if not cheaper. The only one that it doesn't is Funhouse, which technically in the late game, Unity breaks Funhouse a bit cheaper, but only in the late game. So we're going to just play 2 Buzzsaw because it's by far the cheapest way to break all the code gates. I just wish there was more code gates in System Gateway that are above 3 strength. We're going to play 2. Finally, sentries. Those are killers. That's the type of card that breaks sentries. And we have a criminal option and we have a shaper option. So to look at the sentries, we go to this, change S sentry, and we see that there's 4 options. And firstly, we have Tithe. I love Tithe. It's neutral, so everyone can play it. It's 1 cost, 1 strength, so we probably won't be sweating the strength. And it has 2 subroutines that were not necessary to break, but we should probably consider breaking them because they're pretty cool. In the middle, we have Karuna. Karuna is 3 strength, so a bit of a jump up, and has 2 subroutines, 2 net damage you can jack out, and if not, 2 more net damage. Now, these subroutines you probably have to break at some point in the game because you can't sustain 4 net damage to get through a single ice, but 3 strength, 2 subroutines is the next jump up. And finally, we have both Oncel and Ballista, which largely is worse Oncel. They're both 4 strength, so it looks like none of our sentry breakers have to get above 4 strength. One of them has 3 subroutines, but the Biroid Claws, and one of them has 1 subroutine. So largely, we're trying to look at something that gets to 3 and 4 strength, because Tithe is not going to be an issue. Now, our options are Echelon, and Echelon's only a single influence. It is a Shaper Icebreaker, so it scales the later the game goes. It comes in at only 1 strength because it counts itself, and then its strength goes up for every icebreaker we have installed. Which means if we have 3 icebreakers installed, it's only 3 strength. Which means if we have to get through the 4 strength sentries, which are very common in System Gateway, we're going to have to pay 3 credits to go up plus 2 strength, which is a very cursed number. You never want to pay more money than strength. That is kind of rough. This actually does give you an incentive to play Marjana to get a cheap icebreaker on the table to make your echelons better, but at least it's 1-for-1 sentry subroutine. But this is going to be only good in the late game. In the early game, if this is our only icebreaker installed, we're going to spend a lot of money getting up to 4 strength. It'll be very expensive. Now, the criminal option is actually pretty good. This is Carmen. Now, it comes in for 5 credits, which is a lot, but if we made a successful run this turn, this will cost only 3 credits. Notably, if you run Archives, mutual favor to get the Carmen down, you've already made a successful run, so you're only paying 3 credits. It comes in at 2 strength, which means we're going to have to boost for every sentry largely besides Tithe, but at least we boost 2 credits to go up plus 3 strength. So we're going to have to boost for everything, but at least we only boost 2, and then we boost 1-for-1 sentry subroutine. So not perfect. Sentries overall throughout the game are usually the more expensive thing to break. I do think barriers are actually pretty expensive to break in System Gateway, but Carmen seems totally reasonable. It's just as good on turn 1 as it is on turn 7, and technically you have issues. Echelon early game kind of sucks, and we want to be aggressive as much as, again, I want to remind you, you don't need to install your icebreakers on turn 1. You shouldn't install your icebreakers on turn 1. Same reason, we're going to run 2 copies of Carmen, and now we have 2 Fractors, 2 Killers, and 2 Decoders. We have a way to break every single piece of ice. Now, before we go on to the next section, I want to highlight a card that is so important for our breaker suite and for our strategy. And while technically this is an econ card, you can call it, I just want to pull it up now because this does give context to the rest of the deck. This is Leech. You saw Leech. This was part of the booster cards in the Catalyst deck once you played the upgraded version of the deck. It's a cheap virus that comes in for 1 cost and 1 influence. It says whenever you make a successful run on a central server, you get to put a virus counter on that Leech. And whenever you're encountering a piece of ice, you can spend 1 virus counter to decrease the strength of the ice for that encounter. You can do that multiple times, so you can bring the strength down a lot. You can bring the strength down a little, but this card gets free counters when we run central servers, which we want to do anyways, and that brings strength down. Now, you might notice uniquely for our ice suite, our ice all has really awkward numbers for boosting strength. This is 2 to bring a strength up. This is 3 to bring the strength up, which means every leech counter is worth a lot of money. Imagine there's a code gate on the remote server that is 4 strength. We have our Buzzsaw installed. We have our Leech installed. Click 1, we run Archives. We get a Leech counter. Now click 2, we run that remote server, that 4 strength code gate, and we use the Leech counter to decrease the strength of the ice. That ice is now 3 strength. That Leech counter that we spent 1 click running Archives saved us 3 credits. Now that's not the same as clicking for 3 credits, but just to understand, with our Icebreaker suite that does struggle to boost its strength, every Leech counter is worth somewhere between 2 and 3 credits if our deck wants to constantly run. And very importantly, Leech is not a replacement effect. You get the Leech when you make a successful run on the central server, no matter what that run is about. Now, this is a cornerstone card in this sort of deck that wants to be running all the time. If we have our Leech down and we run R&D, not only do we get a Leech counter that's potentially worth 2 credits, we can get the Zahya credit. So we're seeing cards getting paid both in Leech counters and credits. And now those Leech counters will make the next run on R&D cheaper, and we can just basically keep pushing ourselves forward, spending Leech counters to get Leech counters, and just ensuring that all these breakers, we're going to break no ice in the game for less than 1 to 2 credits. Because if we don't care about strength because we have enough Leech counters, we just fly through everything. Leech is just such a natural inclusion for any deck that wants to run a lot, let alone with these sort of breakers that boost really poorly. We're going to be running 2 copies of Leech because it's just a fantastic card in a run-based runner. We'll play 2. It's really quite good. I think this card puts our breaker suite into context because it might seem terrible that we need to spend like, 7 credits to break a Brawn. But the idea is that if we have 3 Leech counters, we now break Brawn for 2 credits. So our Leech counters are incredibly valuable. Now that's our Icebreaker suite. We have satisfied our first camp of ways to deal with ice. We have Fractors, Decoders, and Killers. We have our Leeches to support them. These are just very good breakers, and we need very cheap, efficient breakers because we want to be running all the time. Our next camp we want to talk about, I'm not going to do these in the order I presented them, is multi-axis. Again, we just need to see, as I said earlier, 17 cards on central servers to have a 50% chance to win the game. The number is a bit nuanced. Again, it's a bit of a heuristic. It's not exactly totally accurate the way the Netrunner game works, but just understanding that any card we put in our deck that says run R&D, see 3 cards, that saves us 2 extra clicks and saves us all the money that we could be spending running. So it saves money, it saves time. Multi-axis is just incredibly powerful. And of course, we're playing Zahya. Zahya wants to see more cards when she's running HQ or R&D because she gets more credits. Now, there's not a good way to search for multi-axis using these tabs, right? Some multi-axis cards are hardware, some are programs, some are resources, some are events. So it's not like we can hit a multi-axis tab, but there's a bit of a cheat here. Now, we learned that you can search for subtypes by hitting S and colon and then searching your subtype. The next one that I think is as important as subtype is the letter X. X searches text. So for instance, if we want to look through all the cards in System Gateway that say the word draw on them, let's highlight every single option here. We'll find out there's only 4 cards in System Gateway that draws cards. This is a bit of bleak foreshadowing of our options in System Gateway for card draw, but this is just a very powerful way to search through sets of cards for certain ideas or certain words you care about. Now, multi-axis usually has the word additional written on them because the cards usually say access an additional card. So if we just search X colon additional, we'll see every single card that is a multi-axis card in System Gateway. Now we have 3 options here for multi-axis, and we want to play as much multi-axis as we largely can because not only is it a powerful effect, Zahya really enjoys it. So Docklands Pass is in faction, so we spend no influence on it. That's great. It even has Zahya's art on it, so it's probably going to be a nice include. It's a unique hardware, which means we can have 3 in our deck, but we can only have 1 installed at a time. And it says the first time each turn you breach HQ, access an additional card. It's a very powerful effect. Again, Zahya says now, technically, if you run HQ, see 2 cards, gain 2 credits. It's a soft econ card in some ways. So getting Zahya to fire to see as many cards as many times as possible, this is just a very valuable card. It's multi-axis and it's economy. Now, I'm a really big fan of HQ multi-axis. I think a lot of newer players are hesitant to run HQ because when you run HQ, you access a random card from hand, as opposed to R&D, which is a new card every turn. In theory, if you run HQ and then run back on HQ, you could be seeing the same card turn after turn after turn, run after run, and that kind of just feels quite bad. So I feel like a lot of newer players particularly do not value going for that 1 in 5 slot machine from HQ. They just stick to running the top of the deck. And you should be running HQ. Now with Docklands Pass, when you run HQ, you're guaranteed on the first run per turn to see 2 different cards, which means that sort of feeling of getting that 1 in 5, the 2 in 5 is much more likely, of course, to find that agenda and you won't be accessing that same card twice. Again, how that works is you access 1 card, you decide if you want to steal or trash it, then you put that card aside, and then you access the second card from the options remaining in HQ. After that, the corporation obviously draws them back. So HQ multi-axis is quite important to be able to give you confidence to be running HQ. Secondly, the more aggressive you are as a runner, so say turn 1, we run HQ and the corporation spends 5 credits, 4 credits resing some ice. Now we can run R&D and we're getting credits doing our cool Zahya thing. Now the next turn, the corporation says, I can't let R&D be open. You're going to see all the cards I draw and you're getting Zahya credits. So they put their second ice on R&D. Now we run R&D. They spend the rest of their money resing their R&D ice. At this point, the corporation is bankrupt. So the next couple turns, they're probably just going to be sitting there clicking for credits. But every single turn, they draw another card. If 1 in every 5 card the corporation draws is an agenda, the longer we can slow them down where they have to spend their cards and their credits protecting central servers, the later they'll feel confident or be able to afford putting an agenda and ice on the remote server. Now, the longer we slow the game down by keeping them off their money and keeping them off their, aggressive game plan, the more likely the agendas are to pool into HQ. And that's where cards like Docklands Pass, or more accurately, that's where aggression and forcing the corporation to res their ice can get these agendas to pull up into HQ, which lines up really well with criminal cards like Docklands Pass. So overall, be aggressive. HQ multi-axis feels good because you see different cards. And with Zahya, this is going to pay you off pretty quite well. Now, how many copies are we playing? It's a unique card, so I don't always love running 3 copies of a unique card because copy 2 and copy 3 are not fantastic. We're going to play 2 copies. We're hoping to draw 1 sooner than later because it's a really powerful effect, but 3 just seems like a bit much. So we'll play 2. Now, our other options is we have Conduit. This is a Shaper program and it's 4 influence. So this is a really big choice. But this is a card that I do think ends up in every single runner deck I've ever built in System Gateway. And that's because this is one of the most powerful pressure cards you have access to. When you install this card, every time you run R&D, it gets a virus counter. Now, specifically, if you use the click on the conduit to make a run on R&D, which means you can't play any run events alongside it, you have to hit this button. If you make a successful run on R&D, you'll access additional cards equal to the amount of virus counters on this card, which means first time it comes down, you run R&D, you'll see 1 card. Run back, you'll see 2 cards. Run back, you'll see 3 cards, and so on and so forth. This is just the card in the game that will allow you to see the most cards, which means there's board states where you run R&D with Zahya and gain 6 credits, which is probably more money than you spent getting into R&D, which makes this a self-sustaining loop. It's pretty frightening. Now, importantly too, if the corporation sees that you have a conduit on 2 or 3 counters, yeah, they can put ice in front of R&D, but at some point you'll be able to break that ice, and then the next time you run R&D, you'll see 4 fresh cards in a couple turns, which the only thing they can do, again, is now spend their entire turn purging virus counters. That's an action a lot of newer players forget they have ability to do. It wipes all virus counters, so not only will it clear the conduit, it'll clear the leeches, and that's a bit annoying, so you want to be careful how many viruses you run. But this is a card that once it does hit the table, once you are set up and you want to put that pressure on, the corporation has to deal with this or they will guaranteed lose to it, unless they're very close to being on 7 points themselves. It's just a very powerful tool. Once it comes down, they have to deal with it. If you can run it cheaply on R&D, it snowballs forward. You see more cards into more cards. It's a very strong win condition. Now, 4 influence is definitely going to stop us from playing more than 1 copy because we honestly just don't even have that much influence left. So we're going to play 1 copy, and hopefully by the mid game when we have our breakers and we can deal cheaply with the ice on R&D, this will come down and finish our game. This is our big finishing piece. This is what I mean when decks need multi-access because they need a win condition. Once the conduit comes down, if we can cheaply run R&D a couple times in a row, the corporation is cooked. They really have some problems to sort out. This card is quite powerful. Now, lastly, we have Jailbreak. This is the neutral multi-access, and I do think every single neutral card that you have access to on the runner side of System Gateway, you'll play a full playset of them. This is no different. A Jailbreak says run R&D or HQ. If successful, draw a card and see an additional card. This means as soon as turn 1, if they leave R&D open, if they leave HQ open, you can jailbreak that server, you get a draw card, you get to see 2 of their cards, and then because of Zahya, you get 2 credits back. This is just such a dense card. It does so much. It technically draws a card, which is kind of nice in System Gateway, but it gets multi-access, which means you get Zahya credits. It means you'll see more cards. You can do Jailbreak into DECKLIST Pass, see 3 cards, get 3 credits. This is just a very easy card to play, either in the early game before the corporation has ice or can afford to res ice. But then at that point, once you have your breakers down in the mid to late game, this is just a nice way to spend 1 click to see more than 1 card. And again, 17 is how many cards we need to see. We'll play 3 copies of these. You notice too, now that's our multi-access, and we played every single multi-access option we have access to in System Gateway, which you generally should be doing in System Gateway. I think just about any deck I play in System Gateway plays 1 conduit, at least 1 DECKLIST Pass, and every single jailbreak, just because you need to be able to see as many cards as you can, and these are all our options. Now we've sorted out our breaker situation and our multi-access. We still have to worry about our economy, our card draw, and any sort of spice or tricks we want to put into our deck. However, at this point, we have 14 cards in our deck, so we need 26 more. That's why this isn't red. We're below the 40 minimum. But also, we've spent 12 out of our 15 influence. We only have 3 influence left. At this point, the rest of our deck is largely going to be criminal and neutral cards, which honestly, when it comes to System Gateway, is not surprising. Any faction you play, you end up generally playing every single card in faction and every single neutral card that you have access to, because there's just only so many cards in System Gateway. It's a thing that will change, obviously, with a bigger card pool, but we're probably going to have to be playing mostly from this point forward criminal and neutral cards. So we'll clear the search queries. We'll look at only events, and we'll start here by seeing all the criminal and all the neutral stuff. So firstly, Mutual Favor. As an event, we talked about this before. This is the card that lets us search our deck for an icebreaker and install them. We're running 2 of each icebreaker, so finding our icebreakers naturally shouldn't be too hard, but this card is just really quite good. We're a running based deck, so if we get value from running R&D or running HQ every turn with our DECKLIST Pass and the corporation reses an ice, we want to be able to get our icebreaker sooner than later to break that ice. And so Mutual Favor is a really cheap, nice way. It's technically card draw, and we need as much card draw as we can get in System Gateway. It's very important to understand, while we'll have 3 copies of this in our deck so we can grab our icebreakers as soon as turn 1, you generally don't want to grab your icebreakers quickly. The first phase of the game, you want to be spending clicks just running into stuff. Force the corporation to spend money. If they res their Karuna and you take 2 net damage, that's fine. That won't cost you the game, But spending 4 credits on turn 1 when you only have maybe 5 or 6 credits, that has a huge impact on the game. Only at the point where their ice is rezzed and now you realize, okay, if I want to run HQ to get my Docklands pass, I'm going to need my killer. That is the only time that you grab your killer with your mutual favor or you install it from your hand. A lot of players want to play a bit safely and mutual favor out their breakers, and once they have all their breakers, then they'll start running. I advise entirely against that. Be as aggressive as possible, and only once you see what you need when you need it, then produce the answer. Very importantly, the corporation installs all the cards face down. Most of the things they do is secret. The only secret you have as a runner is the cards you have in your hand. So say that last click you install your cleaver, you install your fractor, you've given up so much hidden information to your opponent, and now they can use that information to largely not make a mistake or shore up some of the weaknesses that they now are aware that they have. If HQ only has a barrier on it, they're hoping that you don't have your barrier breaker. If you show they have your barrier breaker and just end your turn, they have a whole turn to put another ice in front of HQ, and you don't want that to happen. You want your opponent to confidently put an agenda behind a barrier in the remote server thinking you can't break that, and then click 1, you put down the cleaver and you run it. So just make sure you keep your secrets and make sure you're much more aggressive before you get your breakers. None of the face checks, none of the ice that's going to hit you if you run into them without breakers is going to cost you the game. It's going to cost the opponent money, and you want them to spend money. So we are going to have 3 mutual favor because it's a great card and it draws cards and you need that. But at the end of the day, don't rely on this. Only use it when you need it. Now, next up, we have a couple neutral cards. Firstly, this is Sure Gamble. As you might notice in the card suggestions at the bottom, it's been saying play Sure Gamble, and rightly so. This is a card that you'll play as a 3 of in every single deck you're going to play in System Gateway. It's a click for 4 credits button. It's just like Hedge Fund is, and that is a very playable card on turn 1. It's just a lot of money in a single click as long as we're on 5 credits. Just about every single neutral event in System Gateway you'll be playing as a 3 of. So you're going to play 3 Jailbreak, you're going to play 3 Sure Gamble, and also you'll play 3 copies of Overclock. This is a Sure Gamble that makes a run. In some ways, that's actually better than Sure Gamble because we want to run. So you get 4 credits and on the same click, make a run. That's good click compression. Now, these credits, they don't go into your credit pool. So once the run's over, you lose those credits. But if, say, running R&D, running HQ costs you 4 credits, it's now a free run, which is quite nice. Importantly, Overclock can be a bit awkward on turn 1, turn 2, because you don't have Icebreakers, which means it's kind of useless. You can use these credits to trash assets. So if they res an expensive asset and don't ice it up, you can go ahead and trash that. That works out. But otherwise, this is a really good card for the mid game when you do have your Icebreakers out. And again, don't pull out your Icebreakers too quickly. You don't need them. Now, the final criminal event we can play is Tread Lightly. It's a 1-cost run event that says run any server. During that run, ice cost 3 credits more. That's a lot of extra credits, and this hopefully lines up really well with the idea of be aggressive. Again, if you click 1, run HQ, and the corporation feels like they have to res their HQ ice, and then on turn 2, they put something in a remote server, and you tread lightly the remote server, they're probably not going to be able to afford to res it because you were aggressive and you want to control and slow down the game. I often try and use Tread Lightly almost exclusively on the remote server, because the idea is that what's in the remote server? It's either an economic asset like a Regolith mining license or a Nico campaign that they want to protect. And now they either have to pay more money to protect their economy card, which makes it less good of an economy card, or they just can't afford to res the ice suddenly and you can take down their Regolith they're counting on for the following turn. Identically for an agenda, if you tread lightly the remote server, now they can have to pay 9 credits to res their Brawn, which they might not be able to afford, and you get a free agenda. Or if they do res their expensive ice, they might not be able to afford to score out the agenda, which gives you a whole turn to be able to contest that on a following turn, potentially. Very, very powerful. Now, I don't often like to do this on a central server, and that's because at any point in time, if you want to run R&D with a tread lightly, the corporation probably won't res their ice because you're just going to see a single card on R&D, and the top card of R&D is only a 20% chance to be an agenda. However, in the remote server, just about everything the corporation puts in the remote server, you want to consider running. Whether it's an agenda, whether it's a Regolith that will give them 15 credits, those are the sort of cards that the corporation is really incentivized to consider paying 3 extra credits. And if they do, that's a pretty good trade for you. So Tread Lightly is a card that could probably be a 3 of in this deck. I think we're going to start with 2 of, and then we have extra slots. We'll put another one in because it's not necessary, but it's a really fun card to have. Next up, we'll look at the hardware. We have a couple choices here. We're already playing 2 copies of Docklands Pass, but now we have our console, which is Penny Shaver. Consoles are really exciting. You can only have 1 installed. Not only is it a unique, it reminds you of that, but consoles are really important cards. You'll see generally every deck will play a console, and that's because it's a cheap way to get MU and generally has a pretty defining ability that will last the whole game. Now, Penny Shaver costs 3 credits. It gives you 1 MU, and we'll come back and talk about MU in a second. And it says whenever you make a successful run, place a credit on this hardware. That comes from the bank. That is just free money coming into the game. Now you can spend a click to place a credit on this hardware. That's again from the bank. That's not your money. And then you can take all credits off of this. This card is really great because it's exactly what we want to do. Now, if we have a Penny Shaver and we have, say, a leech, we can run R&D. Say it's not iced in the early game. We get a leech counter, which is worth 2 to 3 credits. We get a Zahya credit after we access a single card. That's fantastic. And then we get a free credit that goes onto the Penny Shaver. On a later turn, we can click the Penny Shaver to get a credit, and then all the money comes off the Penny Shaver, which this is just exactly what we want in a deck, a reason to be running every time. In short, this makes every single run 1 credit cheaper or give you a credit if it's a free run. And that's exactly what we want to do with this whole deck. It's a very, very key part of it. So this is a card that we're going to play 3 copies of because we want it in our opening hand as consistently as possible. One of our best opening turns is drop a Penny Shaver, go ahead and jailbreak whatever server is open, gain 3 credits, draw a card, see 2 cards. It's just kind of sick. So very good card. It's unique, but we want to see one as soon as possible because it just does what we want to do, run everywhere and get paid. Now, the last neutral hardware we have is the T400 Memory Diamond. It's a neutral card. It gives us an additional MU. It costs 2 credit, and it says you get +1 maximum hand size. Now, MU on its own is worth considering, and it's something we have to look at before we wrap up the deck. And the question when it comes down to MU is, how much MU is this deck going to need? Again, each program we install takes up 1 MU largely. I think every program in our deck is a single MU card. And so we always want to have an idea of what is our late game rig going to look like. So we have an idea that in the late game, if we've set up everything the way we want to set up, which doesn't happen in every single game, we want 1 of each breaker, so that's 3 MU. We want to have a conduit, so that's 4 MU. And then ideally, if we can get down 2 leeches, just so every run is super, super good for us, that's 6 MU, 1 for each of our programs. Now, inherently, we have 4 MU, again, the reminder text on the identity. And if we get down our Penny Shaver, which we will in every game, we have 3 copies of it, we'll be at 5 MU. Now, that means if we want to hit our really hard late game setup, we are required to have 6 MU in our rig. But that means we might want to consider a single copy of Memory Diamond, just because if we can get 6 MU in the late game, we can actually fill up our 6 MU. I want to be very clear, it's not that important. We could probably play the game on 5 MU and just install the first leech we find, but if we draw this card in the late game, I would install it. If we draw this card in our opening hand, I would not install it. That's because we don't need that 5th or that 6th MU until the late game. So you're just going to ignore this card until the late game if this card still remains in your hand, which it might not. Now, also we get +1 hand size. That's not super important on the runner side. Our corporation that we just built, Precision Design, also has 6 hand size, and that's a much more powerful ability on the corporation side because corporations hide agendas in HQ. So a single run on HQ is now a 1 in 6 to liberate an agenda as opposed to a 1 in 5. That's a big difference, but on the runner side, it doesn't matter that much. Now, just keep in mind in a bigger card pool outside of System Gateway, there might be a couple more decks that can do things like a 6 meat damage combo. And then just keeping your hand size up to 6 prevents you from flatlining to that. So it has some value. That being said, in System Gateway, that has a bit of lethality in it. I don't think being on 6 hand size versus 5 hand size hits any very obvious breakpoints. So it does make you harder to flatline if you keep your hand full, but not incredibly important if you ask me. Now, there is another card in System Gateway that you can put into your deck to give you additional MU. It is DZMZ Optimizer. That's how we say it up here in the north. It's a shaper card and it does cost 2 influence, so it will be most of our last influence, and it gives you an additional MU. Also, it does say the first program you install each turn costs a credit less to install, so it is a soft economy card. Now, looking at our program suite, we're looking to install, best case scenario, 6 programs, which means if we play a single copy of DZMZ, for this to be worth anything, for its text to be active, we need to install it very quickly, which if it's a 1 of in our deck is not very likely. If we draw to our DZMZ after we've installed our 3 Icebreakers, we're spending 2 influence on not a very strong ability because we might get 3 credits back from it. And at that point, I'd rather save the influence and just play a single copy of Memory Diamond. Again, DZ is sick in a lot of decks. Those are decks where you're playing like 9 to 12 programs. But in our deck, where half our programs are redundant Icebreakers, we don't install that many of them. So we'll just play 1 Memory Diamond. If we install it, we install it. We won't install it early. It'll be late game, if anything at all. Next up, programs. We've looked at most of these. Again, a lot of these were breakers. I do want to shout out that there was 1 icebreaker we didn't look at, which is Mayfly. This is the neutral icebreaker. It's an AI subtype, so it can inherently break code gates, barriers, and sentries, which is kind of nice. It does take up 2 MU, which is notably strange, but Also, the math of how it breaks ice is expensive. It's like Morjana expensive. It comes in at low strength. It boosts 1-for-1. At least it breaks 1-for-1. But the big thing about Mayfly is that after the run you use it, it disappears. It does not last long. Now that doesn't line up really well with our deck. Our deck wants to be running all the time, a lot of the time. And that's because we have cards like Penny Shaver and Zahya and Leech. So having a breaker like this that's a one-time shot use just doesn't make a lot of sense for our deck. Now you could say, if I lose my cleaver, this is a nice backup option, but at the end of the day, I'd rather just run a second cleaver, which is what we are doing. Mayfly makes sense for other decks. Even in a bigger card pool, it makes sense. But for us, where we want to run a lot, not fantastic. Last option here is Tranquilizer. This is a really cool option. And this is another sort of trick card that I think you can decide to put into your deck, depending on your matchups and depending on the players you're expecting to play against. There's no sideboarding in Netrunner, so you can't sit across from your opponent and think, oh, they're playing Big Ice, I'll play Tranquilizer. But if your local meta has a lot of Big Ice, consider Tranquilizer. It's a 2-cost virus that comes in and you install it as a Trojan on an opponent's piece of ice, and it gets virus counters. And if it has 3 virus counters at the start of the turn, it will de-res the ice that it's hosted on. This is one of the ways in the card pool to be able to deal with 3 advanced Pharaohs, because we break it for a lot of money with Cleaver and or a lot of Leech counters. This is one of the ways that you can make big expensive ice a bit of a downside to the corporation. And if you're playing against a lot of 3 advancement Pharaohs, I would consider the Tranquilizer. Inherently, I don't like to play the Tranquilizer on its own unless we really need it in the meta that we are playing in, because it's a virus. And we're already playing a fair few viruses. We're playing Conduit and Leech. And as I said before, the more viruses you play, the more profitable it is for the opponent to take a whole turn off to purge all your viruses at once. I don't like playing a lot of viruses all at once unless it's our major game plan, because giving the corporation the ability to set back half our board state by just purging feels bad. If you have 1 virus, that's a harder choice for the opponent. That being said, if you run into big Pharaohs and you're struggling, try drop the 2 copies of Tread Lightly and play 2 Sleepy Snakes and see how that works for you. You might need another memory diamond. You'll see how that again works out, but give it a shot if you're struggling with some bigger ice. Finally, resources. We got some options here. We have Red Team. I like Red Team. It's another run-based payoff card. It costs 5 credits. When you install this, you put 12 credits on it. Then you can spend a click to run a central survey you haven't run yet this turn, and if successful, gain 3 credits. It's a card that lines up with everything else we want to do with Zahya, with Leech, with Penny Shaver. It's a pretty obvious inclusion. Now, notably, you have to spend a click to make this run, so you can't do any other run events with this, like Overclock or Jailbreak. That'll be fine. You'll have a lot of other opportunities to do this. But this is the sort of card I'll put down on the table turn 1 and just start running stuff. Even if it's iced up, they have to res, otherwise we're getting in, and with Zahya, we'll gain 4 credits. It's not hard to get all 12 credits off of this, which means it's a 7-credit econ card on top of all the nice run-based triggers we're doing anyways. I'll play 3 copies because I like Red Team, and it makes us run, which is fun. Next up, Smartware Distributor. This is a neutral econ option. And it's a weird one because it's only a very good econ card if the game goes long. Over a long enough period of time, this will give you infinite credits, technically for infinite clicks, so that's also awkward. But it's an interesting card. It doesn't see a lot of play outside of System Gateway, I'll be honest, but it's a kind of a cool card that allows you to plan your turn. And it's also a card that will give you economy if you're in board states where running is difficult. So say for some reason you draw poorly, you can't get your breakers up, they have some really big ice. It's a nice fallback plan that you can always spend a click to get 3 credits on this and hope there's at least 3 more turns in the game. There usually is. System Gateway is a bit slower. Again, it's a neutral card. It's a card that we're probably going to play 3 of because there's just not that many cards that we have in System Gateway. You'll end up cutting this pretty quickly in a bigger card pool. Next up, Verbal Plasticity. And lastly, Verbal Plasticity. This is the card draw card in System Gateway. It's neutral. It's a resource that's expensive enough at 3 credits, but it says the first time each turn you take the basic action to draw a card, get another one. So this means every turn we want to draw a card, but this is down because it's a click to draw 2 cards. That's exactly the sort of click compression we want. So we're not spending 1 action to draw a card. We're spending 1 action to draw 2 cards. This is a very necessary card in System Gateway. This is the only neutral card, if you don't count Jailbreak, that gives card draw to every single faction. Everybody's going to be playing this, and I play 3 copies of this. The second and third copy are entirely useless because this is unique. It doesn't stack, but you want to get your first one as soon as possible. It's also really cool because it structures your turn with this first time each turn ability, and Zahya being a once per turn ability. It means often your turn is draw once with Verbal, make a run so you can get Zahya credits, probably make another run, and then install a card. It kind of gives you a goal that every turn, if you don't use your card draw, you lose your Verbal value, and so it gives you another thing you want to plan your turn around. We're going to play 3 Verbal because it's the best card draw card we have largely in System Gateway. Now at this point, you notice we're mostly done building our deck. We have 38 cards of that minimum 40 we're trying to hit, so we just need 2 more cards. And luckily also we have 3 influence left over. We're at 12 of our 15. So we just want to make 2 decisions that add up to 3 influence and we should be good to go. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to go back through the different card sections, but instead of looking at the criminal and the neutral cards, we'll look at the anarch and the shaper options and hopefully just pick some stuff that looks good that adds up somewhere to 3 influence. Our first option here is cookbook. This is 3 influence if we want to play this and then add another criminal or neutral card, maybe the 3rd copy of Tread Lightly. Cookbook comes in for 1, and it says when you install a virus program, you may place a virus counter on it. And we do have some virus programs. We have 2 leeches and a conduit. In theory, we could have played some of those sleepy snakes, but this card just doesn't seem like it'll fire a lot in our deck. We're only running 1 copy, so we're not guaranteed to draw it early. This is a very good card in anarchs. Anarchs have a lot of viruses. For our deck, doesn't seem like it's going to do much. The other option is Telework Contract. This is a shaper resource that costs 2 influence, so we can get that into our deck, 1 to install. And it says when you install this, you load 9 credits on it from the bank, and you can spend a click to take 3 credits off of this, and you can only use this ability once per turn. I actually quite like this card. I know we made our deck as run-based as possible, but I do think it's nice every once in a while to also have a card that gives you money that doesn't require you to run. In case you want to set up, in case you don't have your icebreakers in the mid-game after you were super aggressive. I really value cards like this. Notably too, this card just has 8 credits on it. It is an 8 credit econ card, as much as it will take us 4 clicks to get through those 8 credits. When you look at Telework Contract, which is 4 clicks to 8 credits, look at Smartware Distributor and ask yourself, how long does it take you to get 8 credits off Smartware Distributor? It's like 4 clicks, but 9 turns, which is a lot more work and a lot more time. So you might notice that cards like this are actually pretty nice at getting you money relatively quickly. It's not that hard to weave in once per turn to take 3 credits if and when you need it. I like Telework. It's a nice smoothing card, and we feel pretty confident with this in just about any hand. It's a lot of money on a single card. Let's play 1 copy and hopefully find a 1 influence card somewhere else we can weave into our deck. We slide over to programs. There's a couple options. Firstly, we've seen Icebreakers here. We've already looked at all the Icebreakers. Now, a quick trick here for some sorting. We wrote S:"Icebreaker that searches for all the Icebreakers against the programs we're looking at. If you do S!Icebreaker, it will hide all the Icebreakers, which is actually kind of useful here because these are the cards we want to look at. These options here, we have Leech, which we already play. We're Conduit, we're already playing. So the influence options are above the influence that we can play. They're really good cards. Mind you, this is Botulus. It's a Trojan virus that gets a virus counter every turn, and you can use those to break subroutines. This is the other card, I think, in System Gateway that allows you to deal with that 10 strength Pharaohs relatively cheaply. So if that's a problem, you could restructure the deck around this or play an Anarch deck. That also works. But Botulus is a very good card, but for 3 influence, we don't really need it. And then we have Fermenter, which is another econ option that doesn't require interaction. That is a virus-based thing. We don't have the influence, and I think our economy is going to be run-based, and we already have a couple viruses. We don't want to get purged back to the Stone Age, so I don't think we'll consider it. Next up, it's hardware. We're just going to clear this and jump to the hardware tab, and we have a couple options. Firstly, we have a bunch of consoles. So the Anarch console, we don't really need a console. We already have ours, and we can only play 1 at a time. This trashes cards to trash cards. We don't really want to do that. There's the Pantograph, which is the Shaper console. Again, we like our console. And then we have the DZMZs, which we considered, but we don't need that. We're not going to get that much value. We don't have that many programs. So that takes us finally to our events. And we're hoping here to look for a 1 influence option. And we have some good options here. On 2 influence, we have Creative Commission. You notice that this card actually is heavily recommended in the card suggestions. It's saying to play this. This is a really common card a lot of folks enjoy in System Gateway. It's a click for 4 credits, as long as you do it last click, which is not that hard to do. It's a very good card. I'd argue our deck probably doesn't need it as long as we can keep running and keep our run-based engine sustained, which I think we can. And at the end of the day, also for 2 influence, Creative Commission is a click for 4. This is 8 credits. It's a bit more clicks, but I actually like the Telework a fair bit more because it is slower economy, which is a nice thing to sustain yourself on while we're setting up our runs. Otherwise, we have Viarcation, another card we could have considered to get some more card draw in our deck. I don't think card draw is particularly good in System Gateway, so we could value this, but I think we might have enough card draw. We don't need to spend 2 influence. And that leaves us on our last 1 influence card, which is a perfect slot in for our deck. It's the Wildcat Strike. It's a 2-cost event that gives the corporation a choice. So ideally, they're picking the worst thing for us on any board state, but luckily both these options are great. Either we gain 6 credits, which means we clicked for 4, like a Creative Commission, like a Sure Gamble. That's obviously quite nice. Or we get 4 cards, which, considering System Gateway, that's a treat. I honestly think in most board states, we'd rather have that. But if we get 6 credits for a single influence, that is just Creative Commission, but we can play it on most clicks. Unless the opponent realizes that and then gives us card draw, but we'll be fine anyways. That seems like the last include. And that takes us to 40 cards. The minimum we have to play, and we're going to stick to the minimum because small deck is consistent. We're playing all 15 influence, which is what we want to do, importing cards from other faction that gives us strength and some good breakers. Last thing we want to do, just to check this, because I said during the beginning that we want about half our deck to be economy, and we can do a check here to see whether we land that. So we can consider Jailbreak to be an economy card because of Zahya. Maybe that's double dipping, but let's ignore that for now. We're on 3 overclocks, so 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, maybe 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Leech is an economy card, 18 or 19, and very heavily Zahya is an economy card. That's 20 cards. That's basically half our deck is economy, which is largely where you want to be, particularly for your first decks in System Gateway, because running out of money is not fun. Clicking for credits is not great. Having cards that will push you forward more aggressively is fantastic. Just like on the corporation side, you can take a second here to go to the check tab and draw a couple test hands to see if this looks great. So if this is our opening hand, would we keep it? Honestly, I don't love this opening hand because it has 2 of our icebreakers and we are not interested in installing our icebreakers on the first couple turns. We want to run with our face. Best thing about this card is it has Jailbreak, which is our run button, and we have early verbal, which is pretty good. But if we mulligan this, we'll have a better hand. Yeah, this is nice. So we can either do Docklands or Conduit really early if we want to be incredibly aggressive. If they don't ice HQ, we'll do Docklands. But otherwise here we can rely on the telework, we can rely on verbal and set up and get a couple pieces of card draw in. Those being our first 2 card draws, perfect. I fishbowl this a fair bit. This is our opening hand. Again, early Conduit can be a bit expensive. We have the Cleaver, we have the Leech, so we probably start this by doing Leech, and then we Jailbreak whatever server is open. We gain card draw, we gain 2 credits, we see 2 cards, and we get a Leech counter. And from here, we're in a pretty good spot, drawing an aggressive red team, and we'll get all 3 breakers in as soon as we need to, considering we have 2 mutual favors and a Cleaver. One more test. This is okay too. We have an early Docklands, we have an early red team. The tread lightly for the first push in the remote server is night, but we could set up with this. If we mulliganed, it would probably be, wow, that's like the same hand largely. Cool, pretty consistent, works out well. Again, this is Zahya. We picked this for a reason. Be aggressive. Don't install your icebreakers. Just start running into stuff. The consequences, the money that they pay, the information you gain, slowing down the corporation is much more valuable. And you just want to be running constantly because this ability you want to fire every turn if you can. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Last thing you want to do is just give this a smart deck name and then give it a save. Now it'll show up in your decklist page, which means you can duplicate, you can edit, you can copy, you can import this deck onto Giletti.net, all that sort of great stuff. It'll be here forever. And with that, that is our first System Gateway Runner deck. And I think it's a really fun deck. Our next video in this series, what we're going to do is going to be a bit outside deck building, is we're actually going to take this runner deck and take the corp deck we built in the last video, and we're going to pair them off against each other and have some gameplay. I think that's going to be pretty telling. We can focus on play structures and play patterns and some strong fundamentals, but we're going to keep it simple. Again, just System Gateway, so hopefully you know all the cards if you're new to Netrunner. From that point forward, we're going to do some more deck building. We're going to revisit System Gateway and build a different kind of corporation deck, for instance. Like, I want to build a deck that cares about tags or cares about net damage, flatlining in general. And I think that also can be pretty exciting. I think specifically on the corporation side, for only being 41 cards, there's a whole bunch of different win conditions what we can pursue and build some interesting decks. On the runner side, a lot of your decks end up to be pretty similar. Again, for better, for worse. They're still really fun, but there's a lot more flexibility if you ask me on the corporation side. Runner side are just different flavors of being aggressive. That should be the end of the video. Again, if you have any questions at any point, firstly, the deck list is in the comments below in the description if you hit down there. So if you want to just copy it into your deck list and not do deck building, it's there for you for sure. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask in the YouTube comments. And again, if you appreciate this content, if you want to take a second to just drop a like on the video, it's incredibly appreciated. And with that, hopefully you're enjoying System Gateway and you have 2 decks that you can play against one another. We'll be back in the near future with some gameplay to show what that exactly looks like. Thanks for watching. Ciao. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you've been enjoying some deck building basics when it comes to System Gateway. Not only do we have 2 decks that I think will be quite a fun matchup against each other, but we should have some strong fundamental understandings of how to structure both corporation and runner decks if you've watched the 2 videos. From here, again, we're going to be doing some more deck building in System Gateway. There's a bunch of other archetypes that we can focus on that are quite fun, but also we're going to be getting some gameplay up on this channel so you can see System Gateway versus System Gateway and focus on some strong running and some strong corp play fundamentals. Now, I want to give a huge thank you to all these names here and more. At the Métropole Grid, we are supported on Patreon. And so all these names in our daily cast Patrons give me the time and ability to put time into editing and motion graphics and all the live streaming we do around here. This channel just would not be like this if it wasn't for all these nice folks here. Now, if you want to join the Patreon community, you can find the link below. Any amount of contribution is incredibly appreciated. Otherwise, you just want to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff is an absolute great help. Now, if you're new to this channel, you might not know that we stream every Tuesday afternoon and Thursday evening Eastern Standard Time. While I do play largely in the standard card pool, a much bigger card pool than System Gateway, if you ever want to drop in and see what the bigger card pool looks like, ask a bunch of questions. I promise you, I try to make things as approachable as possible. It's often a lot of fun. And with that, we'll be back in the near future with some more System Gateway only content. Thanks so much for watching. Ciao.